March 17, 1943. Berlin, Germany. A smoky room in the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht hummed with quiet tension. Maps of Europe and the Atlantic hung on the walls, annotated with pins marking strategic oil facilities and fuel depots. German intelligence officers, including Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Kruger and Hauptmann Ernst Vogel, pored over reports intercepted from Allied communications and aerial reconnaissance. The room smelled of ink, paper, and the faint tang of cigarette smoke. Kruger tapped a large chart with a gloved finger. "Look. Here," he said, voice tight with disbelief. "Texas, Louisiana, California. The Americans are stockpiling reserves beyond anything we anticipated. Our calculations were off." Vogel leaned closer, scanning numbers of barrels, refinery capacities, and shipping logs. "If these reports are accurate," he muttered, "they can sustain campaigns for years, not months. Years, we cannot compete." The officers' faces hardened as the realization sank in. Throughout 1942, German strategists had assumed that crippling European oil production would force the Allies into shortages. They had planned U-boat campaigns and Luftwaffe strikes targeting ports, pipelines, and refineries, believing this would limit operational reach. Yet here was evidence that the United States had already built a logistical mountain that Germany could not erode. Kruger rubbed his temples, trying to steady his nerves. The room fell silent except for the scratch of pens against paper as clerks compiled charts, graphs, and projections. Each entry seemed to confirm a growing nightmare. America's industrial output, combined with vast oil reserves, meant that even prolonged campaigns across Europe and the Pacific would be sustainable. Germany, on the other hand, faced dwindling fuel supplies and increasingly desperate logistical situations. A junior officer, Lieutenant Franz Huber, hesitated before speaking. "Sir, if the Americans can maintain such stockpiles, does this mean?" His voice trailed off. "Yes," Kruger said quietly, almost to himself. "They can outlast us. We are trapped by our own limitations." For the first time, the officers felt the creeping despair that had been whispered about but never confirmed. The war, they realized, was no longer just a contest of weapons and tactics. It was a battle of industrial capacity and endurance, and in this, Germany was dangerously outmatched. Outside, the early spring sun cast long shadows over Berlin, masking the city's bustling streets from the ominous thoughts unfolding inside the intelligence office. Every shipment of oil, every barrel counted, and Germany's inability to match the production pace was a harbinger of the strategic despair that would soon grip the high command. Kruger closed the file, the edges worn from constant reference, and stared at the ceiling. The Allies' advantage was clear, undeniable. Their fuel stockpiles were a foundation upon which victory could be built, and Germany, he thought grimly, had no foundation left upon which to hope. March 18, 1943. Berlin. Intelligence headquarters. The room buzzed with the low murmur of clerks, officers, and analysts crunching numbers, large maps of the Gulf Coast, all refineries, and shipping routes were pinned across the walls, annotated with red and black ink. Major Heinrich Lutz, a logistics officer with a reputation for precision, leaned over a table littered with charts, cross-referencing production figures from the United States. "The reports are consistent," Lutz said, voice edged with disbelief. "Houston, Beaumont, Port Arthur. Combined refinery output exceeds 7 million barrels per month. Even factoring in distribution losses, they have a supply chain we cannot touch." Oberstleutnant Kruger nodded slowly, fingers drumming on the wooden table. "And this does not account for the reserves in California or the newly constructed pipelines to the East Coast," he added. "Even if we sink their tankers, the Americans have stockpiles inland. They can continue their operations without interruption. Hauptmann Vogel leaned back, eyes narrowing. They can fuel their fleets, their aircraft, even their mechanized divisions in Europe, the Panzer divisions, our Luftwaffe. We are already at the limit. By the time we strike, they will already have replaced any losses. A junior clerk hesitated, pushing a folded chart across the table. Sir, the calculations suggest that even a full-scale German offensive against oil infrastructure would reduce production by only AFR. Action may be 20%. The rest, they can compensate. Kruger swallowed hard, 20%. That's negligible. It's as if we are playing a losing game before it even begins. Outside the office, the streets of Berlin carried on as usual. Citizens passed by, unaware of the stark reality being revealed in smoke-filled rooms above. But inside, the German officers were confronting a truth they could no longer ignore: industrial might. Logistics and oil reserves, not just tanks and guns, would determine the outcome of the war. Vogel rubbed his face. All our victories, all our tactical brilliance, meaningless if we cannot sustain the fight. The Americans have a foundation we cannot destroy, and every day that passes, their advantage grows. Kruger closed the chart with a decisive snap. We must revise our plans. Focus on supply lines. Attempt sabotage. Any chance to hinder them. But the truth is clear. They can endure. We cannot. The weight of the realization pressed down on them. German intelligence had unearthed a fact that could not be ignored. The war was increasingly out of their hands. Strategy alone would no longer suffice. They were constrained by resources, outpaced by American production, and the clock was running out. March 20th, 1943. Wilfschanz, Eastern Front, far from the smoke-filled offices of Berlin. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and his staff convened in a reinforced command bunker. Reports from German intelligence had arrived via encrypted radio and courier figures detailing American oil reserves and refinery capacity. Rommel, usually unflappable, leaned over the long oak table, eyes scanning the numbers with a rare expression of unease. Unbelievable, muttered General von Thadden, pointing to the chart. Even if we destroy the Mediterranean refineries, they have millions of barrels stored in land. They can sustain their fleets, air forces, and armies without interruption. Rommel's jaw tightened. We've been fighting tactical battles, but the strategic picture, it's grim. Every advance we make is undermined by the sheer industrial might of the United States. If this continues, our victories are fleeting. The room fell silent as aides and staff absorbed the implications. Every offensive, every panzer thrust, every Luftwaffe sortie required fuel, yet the data made clear that Germany could not keep up. Allied forces would remain operational, their ships sailing, their aircraft flying, their armored divisions moving as long as supplies flowed from Gulf ports to Europe. Do you realize what this means? Rommel finally said, voice low but firm. We can fight, yes, but we cannot win a war of attrition against a nation that can outproduce us endlessly. Our tanks, our planes, our men, they are limited. Their factories are limitless. Hauptmann Vogel's words from Berlin echoed in Rommel's mind. The Americans can endure. We cannot. The conversation shifted to desperate plans. Targeted bombings of supply lines, U-boat raids, sabotage behind enemy lines. Yet even these measures felt insufficient, piecemeal against the mountain of American industrial capacity. By nightfall, Rommel stepped out of the bunker onto the cold Eastern Front terrain. Stars glimmered faintly above the snow-streaked landscape. He knew that the struggle ahead was no longer purely tactical. The war's outcome would be dictated not just by bravery or cunning, but by oil, steel, and the ability to keep machines running. Germany's realization spread through the ranks like a quiet, Suffocating fog. Soldiers understood they faced an opponent whose resources were vast, whose factories roared day and night, and whose logistical backbone could absorb losses that Germany could not replicate. The despair was subtle but pervasive in knowledge that even heroic actions in battle might ultimately be overwhelmed by an industrial juggernaut. March 25, 1943, Berlin, German High Command. The shock from intelligence reports had rippled through every echelon of the German military. Adolf Hitler convened a meeting with top generals, including Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and General Oberst Heinz Guderian, to discuss the implications of America's oil reserves. Maps were laid out across the polished table, pins marking strategic targets, Gulf Coast refineries, tanker routes across the Atlantic, and supply depots scattered across the United States. "We must strike at their lifeblood," Hitler insisted, voice sharp, eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and desperation. "Every barrel of oil they have, every refinery, every shipment, these are the arteries of their war machine. If we cut them off, perhaps we can slow their advance." Kruger and Vogel presented reports showing the logistical challenges U-boat campaigns had already taken a toll, but the Americans adapted quickly, rerouting shipments and increasing domestic stockpiles. Even sabotage attempts faced near impossible odds, as supply chains stretched from Texas to the East Coast, protected by well-armed convoys and air patrols. Von Rundstedt rubbed his forehead. "Even if we succeed partially, the Americans can replace losses faster than we can inflict them. Their production is a river. Germany's is a trickle." Guderian added, "Our panzer divisions can strike front lines, but without fuel, even the most brilliant maneuver fails, and every day they produce more than we consume in a week. We are running against a clock we cannot win." The generals realized that traditional military tactics could no longer reverse the strategic disadvantage. For the first time, Germany confronted the unvarnished truth. They were fighting a war they could not sustain economically. Desperate measures, raids, bombings, sabotage were no longer about gaining advantage, but about delaying the inevitable. Kruger left the meeting with a heavy heart, knowing that the intelligence officers had done their duty in uncovering the truth. Yet the revelation weighed on everyone like a shadow that stretched across Europe. Allied logistical supremacy, particularly in oil, had transformed the war into a battle Germany could not afford to fight outside. Berlin's streets thrummed with life, oblivious to the despair brewing in command rooms. But for the generals and officers who understood the numbers, the maps, and the fuel statistics, the war had entered a new phase, one in which hope was measured not by courage, but by barrels of oil. Germany's doom, once a theoretical possibility, had become an undeniable reality.